welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I am, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 110th episode, our guest is Jonathan Weisman. Jonathan Weisman is Deputy Washington Editor of the New York Times. He's the author of the novel Number 4 Imperial Lane, which was a Chautauqua Prize finalist, Amazon Best Book of the Month, and Great Group Reads pick at the Women's National Book Association. His latest book is Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump. He has reported for the Baltimore Sun, the Washington Post, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, and others. He is the father of 2 teenage daughters and lives with fellow writer Jennifer Steinhauer in Washington, D.C. And now on to the show.
I'm Jonathan Weisman. I'm the Deputy Washington Editor of the New York Times, and I've written a book called Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump.
Cool. Yeah, and I just finished your book a few days ago. I really enjoyed it. And if you could explain what your relationship with Judaism was before the events with which preceded the writing of this book occurred. From what I understand in your writing, you weren't particularly religious in any real sense before this all happened. Right?
Well, I was raised in Atlanta, in a modestly Jewish household. I was certainly identified Jewish, and I was bar mitzvahed, and I went to religious school. But honestly, in my adult life, I wasn't particularly Jewish oriented, and not particularly religious, which was one of the crazy things about what happened to me, because somehow I was identified by the neo-Nazi alt-right movement as some avatar of Judaism in America.
Right. And I do think one thing that is interesting about Judaism itself is that you can be culturally Jewish and you don't have to be religious. It's kind of a race and a religion, and that's different from other religions and races because they kind of are separate in that way. Is that right?
Right. There is a sense of Judaism as a culture, as a people, and that, it's traditionally passed on matrilineally. So if your mother is Jewish, you are born Jewish, you're Jewish. That's all there is to it. There aren't a lot of hoops to jump through if you have the golden ticket of a Jewish mother.
Right. Well, and that's good that you brought that up, because one of my good friends, Brian, is Jewish, and he's telling me that he was experiencing some amount of prejudice from other Jewish people, because actually it's the reverse for him. His father is Jewish and his mother is not. And I know, like you said, that's a matriarchal thing, and that's something you've run into, I guess, in your life, right? That some people like.
It is obviously I have 2 daughters, and their mother is not Jewish, and they weren't raised particularly Jewish at all. But one of them, my younger one, who's 15, she identifies very Jewish, and yes, technically, in fact, she is. If she went to Israel, for instance, the Israelis would not identify her as Jewish. She would not be considered Jewish. But she considers herself Jewish, and I think that in at least kind of liberal traditions of the United States, and especially in the less rigid Reform synagogue movement, we'll take anybody.
It's a little more open, right? But are there any other major religions that you can think of that could also be classified that way? Because I was talking about this with my wife, and she was a religious studies major in college, and I was saying I thought almost Mormonism could seemingly fall into that category, because it seems like there was that bottleneck where they were this kind of tribe of people that were off in the desert, a different desert, of course, but it's kind of one point in history, and it kind of springs from that, and I see some common characteristics. But she said that analogy really doesn't work because Jews aren't evangelical in any way. What's your take on all that?
The thing is, remember, it goes back to the sense of the 12 tribes of Judah, right? That in some ways, through the millennia, Jewish blood has obviously mingled with all sorts of blood, but there is at least the notion that we all go back to this small group of tribes in what is now Israel and the Middle East, and that we were scattered to the winds after various conquerors of Judea and Samaria. So it is different. I mean, in some ways, No, in some ways, I can't really figure out any religion like this, because the difference between Judaism and Mormonism, or Islam, is that Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and certainly Islam, believes in the active spreading of the religion. They want to take over, over as many as Mormons as they could be, and so the community of of Muslims called the Ummah, that's an ever-expanding community, whereas the Jewish people, we are not particularly aggressive in proselytizing. In fact, we're very not. If you can convert to Judaism, certainly, but Jews do not go out and seek to convert you. So it's a much tighter knit community.
Sure, absolutely. Well, you kind of alluded to this a minute ago, but I guess this probably be a good time to explain kind of what happened to you and what led to the writing of this book. You posted an article, was it before Trump was elected or after?
It was during the primaries.
Okay.
It was in May of 2016. And I'm an editor. I wasn't writing at the time. I used to, for most of my career, I was a writer, but I'm an editor now. And actually, it was in the Washington Post. There was a column by a guy named Robert Kagan, a conservative scholar, actually, at the Brookings Institution, called "This is How Fascism Comes to America." And I took a little bit of it, and took a clip of it, and put it on the internet, on Twitter, and sent it out into the world. And I got a strange note back that said, "Hello, Weisman." That's it. It was from Cyber Trump, and Weisman was in three parentheses. I didn't know what that meant. I had never seen that notation, the three parentheses. I had a feeling that it had something to do with the Jewishness of my name, that Weisman is a Jewish-sounding name. And I said, "Care to explain?" And he sent back another tweet that said, "What ho, the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence. It's a dog whistle fool. I'm belling the cat for my fellow Goyim." And afterward, almost immediately, there was just this onslaught of Twitter messages that were the basest, ugliest forms of anti-Semitism you could imagine. Not just obviously Jewish stereotypes, but me with my head superimposed on a figure who's kneeling down and about to get his head blown off by a Nazi, or me in a gas chamber with Trump about to throw the switch and him in a Nazi uniform. Pictures of my face superimposed on Holocaust victims, such and such and such. It just went on and on and on. What was amazing about it is how organized it was.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of like a tactic that you go into the book, and you talk about Gamergate, and I know you interviewed Zoe Quinn, and it almost seems like Gamergate was a training ground for kind of what came next as far as the 2016 election and kind of what happened with you. Tell a little bit about her story and kind of what you learned from her.
Well, what's interesting is that Gamergate in some ways was a dry run for the alt-right. And just to refresh your listeners on this, there was a small group of women video game designers. They were designing feminist video games, games that were designed to appeal to women, not men. And there were a lot of gamers kind of living in their basement on 4chan and 8chan and talking about video games. And they decided that they hated these women. They wanted to destroy them. And they learn how to weaponize the internet through Gamergate. They learn how to dox people or swat people or just try to ruin their lives by just pounding them with messages, emails, texts, putting out intimate details of their lives, some of them true, many of them false, just making their lives miserable. And the reason that Gamergate was so important to the kind of the neo-Nazi alt-right was that before Gamergate, and Gamergate was around 2012, I think, 2011, 2012, before Gamergate, all of these guys, the neo-Nazis and the alt-right, were living in their own websites. They had, the Daily Stormer or Stormfront or like the National Policy Institute. They talked to each other. But what they saw with Gamergate was that if you got your message out through more accessible channels, like 4chan and 8chan and the chat rooms in YouTube or Reddit, then you could then people would see your message that weren't part of your team, and they would sign on, and they also learned that, whoa, we could really, we don't just have to organize with the internet. We could actually use the internet as a weapon. And I think that was a really important moment for the alt-right movement.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And you mentioned this when you were explaining what happened to you, but the three parentheses thing, was that was a Google plugin, right, that allowed them to search by that? Is that?
Yeah, I'll quickly explain. Nobody knew. It was called the coincidence indicator. That it was such a innocuous name that Google didn't even notice. Didn't know what it was on. It was a Google plugin. You could download it, and on Google, if you actually do a Google search, Google does not ordinarily pick up punctuation marks. But if you download the coincidence indicator, you could specifically look for these three parentheses, and then that would tell you, as a neo-Nazi, as a follower of the alt-right, who was being targeted. And generally, it was Andrew Anglin, at the editor of the Daily Stormer, that was deciding, which mostly Jewish journalists to target. And once they belled the cat with the three parentheses, then anyone who was a follower of Andrew Anglin could then go and search out the latest mark.
Right, and then a similar thing happened to, you mentioned this in the book, was that Julia Yaffe also did a thing on Melania Trump, and then that kind of, the storm descended upon her as well after that?
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, there were quite a few. Ironically, one of the most attacked journalists was Ben Shapiro, who was a ardent conservative,
right.
But Ben Shapiro had been on Breitbart, and when Breitbart kind of took a turn toward anti-Semitism, he quit Breitbart, and I think he got the attacks that the apostates get. Right, he was a backslider, so he was really targeted.
They hate them worst of all, right?
So Julia Yaffe, at that time during the campaign, was a freelance journalist, and she had written a profile of Melania Trump for GQ, in which she went back to Slovenia and found a long-lost half-brother of Melania. And Melania declared that this was too intrusive. She did not like this. And then Andrew Anglin at the Daily Stormer said that Princess Melania did not like this. He belled Julia Yaffe, and Julia Yaffe was just deluged with threats, death threats, rape threats, the worst kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, and remember, when Julia Yaffe, when all this was happening to Julia Yaffe, Melania was asked by a different women's magazine, what do you think about what's happening to Julia Yaffe? She said, well, she provoked it. So no, they weren't exactly trying to tamp this down.
Right. But as far as Google goes, they did remove that plugin eventually once it was kind of found what was going on, right? That's not a thing that happens anymore, right?
They did, but I'm telling you, if you go onto Google right now and look at it, you'll find it. The coincidence indicator now just has its own website, coincidenceindicator.com, I think.
Gotcha.
So,
still out there.
It's still out there.
But you took an interesting tactic when this first started happening. You started retweeting people to kind of show, this is what I'm dealing with, this is what I'm seeing in my mentions. It seems like you kind of came to the conclusion that was counterproductive. Is that right?
I think it was, look, I thought it was very important that people out there in the world saw the kind of hatred that was being stirred up by the Trump campaign. Remember, most of these people, they went by things like Cyber Trump. Their avatars were Trumpy. They were sending out pro-Trump messages, and I thought it was important for people to realize that a lot of hatred and bigotry was being stirred up by the 2016 campaign. So, and I don't regret having done that, but I also did know that, hey, somebody who has 100 Twitter follows being retweeted by somebody who has 60,000 Twitter followers, you're amplifying that guy's message a lot, and that guy is going to like that. He sent you that because he wanted you to see it, and he doesn't mind that other people are seeing it. So, in a sense, I think that my effort to get the message out that this was going on kind of egged on more attacks and got their message out to a broader audience. It also did give a lot of people a sense of what happened. And in fact, Twitter, in the end, responded partly because an editor at the New York Times was one of the victims. So, it was not all bad.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It seems like they've taken a little bit of action as far as trying to tamp down on some of these. How do you think Twitter and them have responded in the months and years since this has all started here?
What's funny about it is that when this first started happening, Twitter was exceptionally reluctant to do anything. I didn't really understand it because, people talk about this as a free speech issue, but Twitter and Facebook and most social media platforms, first of all, they're private companies. They're not governed by the same rules that govern free speech on the public square. They get to set the terms of speech, and they do, because when we sign up, we click on "I agree with your terms of service," and even if you didn't read the terms of service, you still clicked on the agree button, and and by agreeing, you said, "I will not use this platform to attack people based on race, color, ethnic origin, or religion," so it is not an infringement of your rights if you agreed not to do it. And at first, I would send the most egregious attacks on me to Twitter and say, hey, this guy is obviously breaking your rules. And Twitter would come back and say, we see no violation of terms of service. And even if they did see a violation, they might X out that account, and then that same person just opens an account with a slightly different name, because, you can use, because you can be anonymous on Twitter. They didn't do much of a good job at all, and they didn't seem to care. But then when it got really bad, when this was starting to get a lot of publicity, they said, we're going to shut it down. And they've done a lot to shut it down. And I do not get attacked the way I used to. And trust me, I know that they're still out there. But Twitter now is doing a good job. They've probably created the algorithms to sweep through and look for the racist language, racist imagery, anti-Semitic imagery, and tamp it down. So no question they can do it. Now I go onto places like 4chan and 8chan to see what's going on, because there are no rules there.
Sure, absolutely. It's still the Wild West over there. So
exactly.
Well, I guess if you're a world leader, you can say what you want, right? Because that's their new policy. So all they got to do is get themselves elected.
Some people have said many of Trump's tweets do violate their terms of service, but obviously Trump is not going to.
Sure, no, absolutely not. No. I noticed when you say the word alt-right, and I agree with you, it's a hard word for me to say in my mouth because we already had these terms for these people. What do you think about that term alt-right, and how should we talk about people like that? Because it's been a controversy.
It's interesting that you ask that. I mean, the alt-right is a term that they gave themselves.
Right.
I mean, Richard Spencer, one of the leaders of the alt-right, coined the phrase. And remember, and it goes way back. It was coined around 2007, 2008, because because this was a group of people who became very disenchanted with the Bush era. They did not like Bush's foreign policy interventionism. They didn't like the war in Iraq. They didn't, and they were very upset about the collapse, obviously, of the financial system in 2008. And alt-right meant alternative right, the idea that we're going to look for a new kind of conservatism. And they hit on kind of white nationalism. It's really a white nationalist movement. So you're right. The term alt-right is kind of whitewashing them. If we call them white racists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, that would be more. It would be more accurate. But we kind of tend to fall into the nomenclature that they give themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's been also kind of an ongoing controversy in journalism in general as to how to cover these people, and I can kind of see both sides of it. And obviously, you had to write about these people in your book, but on the one end, it's like we want to know your the people that are want you in an oven or whatever, but on the other end, you don't want to whitewash or give a soft focus Barbara Walters, Nazis just like us, So how did you, I guess, when you were going to your book, especially, how did you go about writing about these people in a way that was both fair but also not kind of glossing over things that need to be kind of brought into focus here?
I don't think I glossed over anything.
Oh no, I'm not saying you did, absolutely, but I'm saying that's happened in journalism.
Look, thing is that the thing about them is that they don't try to hide the fundamental bigotry and hatred in their ideology. There's Andrew Anglin wrote on the Daily Stormer wrote a guide to the alt-right. It's still available. You can go on there right now, and it's very open. And some of the attacks that they have launched are so brazen that just talking about what happened, for instance, to the Jews of Whitefish, Montana. I mean, in Whitefish, Montana is a very small town outside of Glacier National Park, had a very small Jewish community in the greater Whitefish area. There are about 100 Jews. And one of those Jews happened to be a realtor who was semi-friendly with Richard Spencer's mother. Richard Spencer's mother, at that time, there was a movement afoot in Whitefish, which has kind of a liberal, crunchy, green population. When they found out that Richard Spencer was raised in Whitefish and that his mother still lived there, they were talking about organizing protests and boycotts of Mrs. Spencer, and in a kind of a casual way, Tanya Gersh, the realtor, the Jewish realtor, suggested, you don't need this. Maybe you should sell your building and just get away. And and then Richard Spencer's mother accused her of trying to drive her out of town. And the response was to organize a mass attack on every Jew in the greater Whitefish area, to target an entire community. And it was so ugly and so out there. And the local rabbi, the synagogue, had to get armed guards, and it was, just spelling it out gives you a good sense of the willingness of the aficionados of the alt-right to go after real people. And it's not just an internet phenomenon. It can be a very destructive force.
Right. Well, I think that was the big thing about Charlottesville, is like you pointed out in the book, it's like they're coming out of the online and into the real world or whatever. This isn't just online trolling. This is for real. Like, and things are really happening in the real world. So that's the difference now that I see. So.
Yeah, I had actually as I was I'd almost finished writing the book at the time of Charlottesville, and while I was writing it, there was a follower of what he called the Alt-Reich in German. The Alt-Reich had come upon a young African-American student outside the University of Maryland and asked him to step aside from the sidewalk, and he didn't step aside, and the follower of the Alt-Reich stabbed him to death right there on the streets of College Park, Maryland. And then there was a even probably more famous episode where a guy from the alt-right was screaming at these two young teenage girls in their hijabs on the light rail in Oregon. Two men stood up to him and started yelling at him, and he turned and stabbed them to death. Two grown men on broad daylight on the light rail in Portland, Oregon. So the notion that this is a harmless movement on the internet that we could just ignore, I think is belied by the blood on the ground these days.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, for sure. One thing I really appreciate that you touched on in your book was kind of the sick support that some super right-wing evangelicals have for Israel and kind of Zionism. And it's kind of always been a weird thing to me, because it's so obvious what's happening is that they just, I mean, as you describe in the book, they just want to get the Jews into Israel to convert them to Christianity to bring on the apocalypse. So it's kind of like a pretty sick relationship.
Necessarily to convert them to Christianity.
Oh no, they don't have
According to Revelations, there is going to be an ingathering of the Jews back to the Jewish homeland, Israel, and then once that happens, Jesus will return. There will be the great battle between good and evil, and everyone who is not not saved will die and be swept to hell. And what happens to the Jews is immaterial. They have one role to play, and that role is to gather to this plot of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. Right.
Well, it seems like for now it seems okay, but if you play this out all the way to the end, it doesn't seem like such a great deal. You know?
Yeah. No.
Yeah, but it's a pretty much a temporary marriage of convenience, right? Because it serves the needs of people that are Zionists in the moment, and it serves the needs of the other side too for the long term, I guess. But
and I think that the conservative government of Israel under Netanyahu, they understand Netanyahu does not believe that the ingathering of Jews will herald the second coming and the end of the world.
Sure, yeah.
So so they don't think it's a temporary marriage of convenience. It's a permanent marriage of convenience.
Right, because the other part will never come to pass.
The other part will never happen.
Yeah, that's a good point. But since you've been exploring, the topic of Judaism professionally, and that you've obviously been thinking about it a lot, what effect on your personal life has it had with your relationship with that, both, I guess, culturally and religiously?
Well, I actually do believe. I mean, I have become more religious in the process of this. I talked to a lot of people, a lot of Jews, and a lot of rabbis to talk about my experiences and how we combat the rise of anti-Semitism and bigotry more broadly. And I remember having this conversation. I was after I got divorced like 4 years ago now. Right after my divorce, my younger daughter said, "Okay, now that you're on your own, I want a Jewish education. I want to join a synagogue. I want to be bat mitzvahed." And we did. We joined a synagogue. We were a member of a synagogue just outside of Washington. But I was talking to a different rabbi and a rabbi from a different synagogue named Dan Zemmel. And we were talking about how the tactics that should be used to confront the rise of hatred in this country. And some rabbis have said the best thing to do is ignore it, because that by confronting it or having these open fights with the Richard Spencers of the world, we were just giving them what they wanted. Other people said no, we should fight. Other people had come up and he said, look to the Torah, look to the Bible, it says when a Jew confronts injustice, a Jew must stand up to injustice. So he started talking about the religion of Judaism in such a way that I thought, there are answers in my own religion. I just have to look for them. And I actually quit my other synagogue, joined his synagogue, have been going to services a lot more, and I've come to the conclusion that religion is very helpful to navigate to navigate the world that we live in, which is ever more complicated and ever more confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to Charlottesville a little bit, as far in terms of anti-Semitism, I think that was a real wake-up call for people. Like, I think people kind of realized, when they saw the images coming out of Charlottesville, they really realized that this is not just, like you said, online trolls playing around. There's blood on the street, and there's people that are dying and getting hurt. We kind of end your book on a hopeful note about people looking for solutions. So, what do you see going forward? As far as, do you think things are getting better? Do you think people are waking up to this? Is this real?
I think people are waking up. I think that there's a sense out there now, searching for a response. And as I say in the book, I think if Jews stand up and scream anti-Semitism, or blacks stand up and talk about racism, or Muslims stand up and talk about Islamophobia, there is always going to be a sense of, well, you're just doing this for yourself. It's self-serving. You're exaggerating the problem. You're trying to draw attention to your own plight. And then there's another response, which is, you think you got it bad, we've got it worse. And then there's kind of one-upsmanship on the victimization scale. And what you're seeing now more and more are coalitions forming between immigrant groups, Muslims, American Jews, African Americans, to stand up together against bigotry and hatred, because I think that is the way to confront it. You can't get up and get involved in one-upsmanship, and you can't really deny the upswell of bigotry, especially if you talk about it in its totality and not break it down to its components.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. And you also mentioned this in the book. It kind of goes back to the civil rights era of, the black and Jewish, civil rights, like the Freedom Riders. There was a lot of cooperation there. So I think when people realize that there's kind of a universal threat, not specifically to just their group, I think that's when things actually move forward. You know what I mean? So
right, and I talk about that in the book too. There was a sense that coalition of blacks and Jews in the civil rights movement was immutable, was always there, will always be there. But in fact, that's not true. I mean, African Americans and Jews and Jewish Americans have sometimes been at odds, have sometimes gone their own way, and that coalition in the civil rights era was a model for the future, a model for the present, but it wasn't. But I mean, we have a long way to go to get back to that tightness and that level of cooperation.
Right. You mentioned your kids, and I also have 2 kids, but they're younger than yours. But what do you tell them about social media after you've gone through all this? Going back to your kind of Twitter mob experiences, going forward, how do you tell them to deal with the online world?
Yeah, mine are 18 and 15, and to be honest, they have a lot more to teach me than I have to teach them. I mean, it's funny because my 18-year-old helped edit my book. She wrote it all the time, and she actually is a very talented writer, but she also just has a sense of what's going on. She was actually the one who said she wanted me to see this guy PewDiePie. PewDiePie is this YouTuber who has got these enormous tens of millions of followers all around the world. He's actually a Swedish guy, but he does his little YouTube acts in English. And PewDiePie, who has, as I said, millions and millions of followers, had done this thing where he was talking about the new website Fiverr, where you could hire anyone basically for $5 to do anything. And he kept talking about he had hired these guys in India to do something super secret for him, and he was all excited about whether they were going to really do it. Well, could I really get them for $5 to do this super secret thing I asked them to do? And he uploads a video that they have sent him to prove that they did what he was going to do. And what it was, these two Indian guys in some kind of jungle somewhere in India, dancing around, and then they unfurl this banner, and it says "Death to all Jews." And PewDiePie acts all embarrassed. Oh my gosh, I can't believe they did this. Oh, I feel terrible. Oh, this is so bad. Oh, this is so bad. I can't believe I asked them to do this. And he makes a big show of contrition. But the amazing thing is that he did it. What made him think, I'm going to have these two Indian guys unveil a banner that says "Death to all Jews"? And I think about all of the young, boys, the 12-year-old boys who love PewDiePie, who for the first time saw the phrase "Death to all the Jews" on that show.
Right.
As you asked me, what do I tell my kids? Well, my kids tell me things, and they say this stuff is everywhere. Now they're a little more I think they were a little more dismissive. People don't take this stuff seriously. And I say, you have no idea. The fact of the matter is, the guy who shot up the school in Parkland, Florida, was swimming in this stuff. He had a swastika on one of the magazines of his AR-15.
Yep.
The guy who just shot up the school in Santa Fe, Texas, there's evidence that he was swimming in this stuff from his Facebook page. So I think that, especially young men at ideologically vulnerable ages, if they're searching for something to give them, to make them a part of something, and they run into hatred, and the whole notion that there's a white genocide going on, that the whites are being crushed by the Jews and the blacks and the Latino immigrants and the Muslims, they want to join that they're susceptible. And I think that social media is a wonderful tool for outreach, but it is also a dangerous tool for those who are vulnerable to this kind of ideology.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it kind of reminds me of how they talk about, ISIS, self-radicalizing people online, and how different is that really from what we're talking about right now with this neo-Nazi stuff? It's pretty similar to me.
It's different in that in the United States, a hell of a lot more people have been killed by self-radicalized right-wing terrorists than by Muslim terrorists.
Oh, absolutely, sure. But it's like a social contagion, though. It's like you said, we don't take it seriously. People that know better, but there are people that don't know better and do take it seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but you're usually writing, straight journalism, and that's kind of what you've been versed in. And this, you get to say a little bit more about your life, and obviously your last book before this was a novel. So how has it been, kind of switching between formats here and these different things you've been doing?
It's a good question. I mean, the first book I wrote, that novel, had been bouncing around my head for 20 years. A lot of it is based on real life experience, and I'd always been a journalist, so I was taught to tell my story, what I'm trying to convey, as fast as possible. And in writing Number 4 Imperial Lane, I had to learn how to write slowly, to spin out a scene, to describe it, to understand that there are no limits here. I don't have to finish this in 12 inches of copy. And writing this book was much more of a journalistic exercise. It combined personal experience with actually going out, interviewing, talking to people. I wrote it very quickly because I wanted it to be in the nation's bloodstream as fast as possible. In fact, I finished this book right about at the time of Charlottesville. I had to pick it back up, put feeds the Charlottesville experience throughout it. Mm-hmm. But this book was done by the fall of 2017, and we rushed it. I actually said, "Can't we get to move up the publication date?" And they just wouldn't do it.
Right.
But I certainly, I guess at one point there was some concern that by the time this book came out, maybe the alt-right would be gone, that all this bigotry would have ebbed, and it certainly hasn't.
No, absolutely not. Is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you'd want to get in there before we go here?
Well, there's one thing I always like to say, which is that I think that standing up to bigotry and standing up for democratic pluralism, this is not supposed to be an ideological thing. There's, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, there are certain lines that we used to not cross in our political discourse. And I wish that we would get back to the point where it was not seen as a political statement or a statement of bias to say that we're all in this together, and that this is a nation that does not believe in bigotry and hate. But somehow this has become a loaded phrase, an anti-Trump phrase. I don't mean it to be an anti-Trump phrase. I mean it to be the reconstruction of the norms of American society.
Mm-hmm. Right, and a lot of things that are changing aren't things that are like laws. It's just things that we've expected to be the same and just aren't the same as we expected them to be. So
exactly.
The last question I always ask before we go is, what music have you been listening to lately?
Oh, when I was driving to work this morning, I was listening to Green Day's latest album. So if you really want to know, but I was also at Jack White's concert a couple of days ago. Oh my God, it was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
It
cool.
Was amazing, so,
I saw the White Stripes back in the day. I haven't seen any of the new stuff yet, but
yeah, he's actually kind of got a harder edge than his White Stripes days.
Oh, cool, awesome. Well, great. Well, everyone should read your book. I really enjoyed it, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Right, have a great day.
It was fun. All right. Bye.
If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways to support it. Join the Rob Burgess Show mailing list. Go to tinyletter.com/The Rob Burgess Show and type in your email address. Then respond to the automatic message. I have a Patreon account which can be found at patreon.com/Rob Burgess Show Patreon. I hope you'll consider supporting in any amount. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review everywhere the podcast is available, including iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Facebook, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, and RSS. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgessshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. And if you have something to say, record a voice memo on your smartphone and send it to therobburgessshow@gmail.com. Include voice memo in the subject line of the email. Until next time.